I can't figure out my password. So we're just going to record. All right. Good evening, everyone. So this is Dr. Famuyiwa with Montgomery Fertility Center. I want to thank everyone who's here tonight. I know you could be eating dinner, and I want to thank our panelists. So today we're going to talk about surrogacy, what it is, what's involved, what are the things that you need to be aware of. And tonight I have two wonderful guests with me. So I'm going to introduce them. Let me see. It's Dr. Wellington and Yashika Cantrell, who are going to go over an expose of what is involved with surrogate. Part of what we want to do is talk about the psychological perspectives, the legal aspects of surrogacy. What do you need to be concerned about? The ethical considerations, best practices. I want people to ask questions and answer. So Dr. Wellington is going to introduce himself for more, but Dr. Wellington has a doctorate degree in psychology, in counseling psychology. He is a lead consultant with Wellington Consultants for the past 20 years. He's a professor with Bowie State University, and he also has leadership services under Prince George's County. Okay. Ms. Cantrell is the owner and founder of Legacy Surrogacy. She has a degree in economics and has worked with a Fortune 500 company in the back-end industry for the past 12 years. And she approaches her work from a faith aspect. So I'm going to unshare here and maybe talk a little bit about some of the medical perspectives of what you would look for in surrogacy. But I really want you guys to engage Ms. Cantrell and Dr. Wellington and hopefully have a lot of time at the end for questions and answers, okay? So from a medical perspective, what do we look for in a surrogate? Well, one of the things that you look for is how old is your surrogate? You know, someone who's young enough to carry a pregnancy and go through the rigors of a pregnancy. You know, you don't want someone ideally in their 50s or 60s. They could have health issues or may have complications with the pregnancy. If someone has had a successful pregnancy in the past, that's always good to know, versus someone who has not had a successful pregnancy. We look at mental health issues. We look at lifestyles and the habits of patients. They have to be screened for any infectious disease. And also we talk about uterine health. Do they have fibroids? Do they have an abnormal uterus that could cause problems when it's time to carry the pregnancy? So what I'd like to do is have Ms. Cantrell introduce herself, and then Dr. Wellington is going to introduce himself as well. After that, Ms. Cantrell will dive into her part of what she wants to teach us. Ms. Cantrell.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yashika Cantrell of Legacy Surrogacy, and tonight we're going to talk a little bit about some of the legal aspects of surrogacy and the two most important documents that are necessary through a surrogacy journey.
Great. All right. So I would also like Dr. Wellington to introduce himself. and then he can give us a little bit of an opener from his perspective as well.
Good evening, everyone. Again, this is Dr. Roderick Wellington. We're coming with you from Wellington Consultants Therapeutic Healing with over 25, 30 years actually in the mental health arena. And what I want to give, as Dr. Fumi says, a psychological perspective. What should we be concerned with on both ends, the donor and the receiver? And what should not, or who should not be a donor? So we're going to go into depth with that this evening.
Fantastic. So what I'd like to see if we can get started, and we'll do a little bit of back and forth a little bit. So Ms. Cantrell, tell us what to expect. So someone wants to get a surrogate. How would you start with that surrogate journey? How would we get started in getting a surrogate? What do we need to do to get started?
Well, the first thing you need to do is obviously you figure out finances. That's a huge part of the surrogacy process. It has to be paid for. So set aside what you think would be necessary, do your proper research. I'd always say then add 25% even to that. Decide whether or not, or with your doctor really, decide whether or not you're going to be able to use your own biological matter or if you will need, assistance with that. So if you're the mother, is it your egg or are you going to need an egg donor? I'm sorry, if there's a partner involved, will you need sperm? Will he need help with this process? So those sorts of things. And then, going through the process with IVF and creating those embryos and testing those embryos to see how many you actually have that are viable embryos. And that is really where you're starting. And that's an expensive process in and of itself before you ever get to the actual surrogacy piece. Because we talk about them together, but they really are separate. IVF and surrogacy.
Yeah. So I guess, Yashika, what you're saying is there is the part where how are we going to get to the eggs or the sperm that we need, right?
Correct.
What is the health of who's giving us the sperm or the egg before, right?
Correct. You have to look at the health challenges. You have to go through a battery of tests. Your reproductive endocrinologist is really the second person because initially you're going to be with your gynecologist and they're going to look at various things. And then after that, you will go to your reproductive endocrinologist to see what is your health? What does your uterus look like? What does your egg reserve look like? All of those things. Can we get, because for some people it is important that the child is biologically connected to them. And for some people it is, I want a baby. So you need to figure out all of that as well.
Correct. So I guess we're dealing not with just the health of the surrogate, we're dealing with the health of the intended parents in this aspect. So before we go to the legal aspect, Dr. Wellington, what should they be feeling? What is going through their mind? Like, I'm confused, I don't know, I'm scared. What's going to happen with this process? Is this even my child? What are the kind of issues would you be dealing with?
Yeah, thank you, doctor. That's one of the number one questions that I ask the clients when I talk to them to do a psychological assessment. Are you understanding what you're about to partake in? Have you been explained to you the process, the pros and the cons? Are you psychologically ready for it? And the beauty of the donor and the receiver is that they get the chance to manipulate the system, so to speak. Just give you an example. A traditional husband and wife, they might be together for 5 years, they have their first child. They might not know a lot of history about the other side. And unfortunately, if a schizophrenic husband and wife both have 50% chances that their child is going to be schizophrenic. But if you know these things up front, you do the research and you know that the donor is sound. That's the number one issue we want to know. Is there any health issues? Does the family have a lot of psychological issues? But that's what you want to know. Are you able to carry or receiving this embryo with a sound mind.
Correct. Thank you very much. That's a good point. So Yashika, I know that you and I have talked in the past. What is involved? Who, like, I know that for the recipient and the surrogate in this case and the intended parents, there are certain steps. They need to get legal counseling. They need to get psychological counseling. Can they go to one place to get all this done? Can they go to a one-stop shop and, check all the marks off?
I would say, and most people would say, absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a delicate dance, and there's so many players involved that everyone needs to be represented legally. So the gestational carrier needs her own attorney. The intended parents pay for it, but she needs her own representation legally. The intended parents need their own representation legally. So what it would typically look like, I don't know, do you want me to go into that now? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the big documents that you're going to need is the contract. It's called a gestational carrier agreement. So with the gestational carrier agreement, I recommend initially each individual party sort of figuring out what they want it to look like. So the gestational carrier and her partner, if there is one, they sit and talk about, financially, how much would I like to be compensated, at each of these steps? Am I willing to pump and give them my breast milk? And if I am, how much am I going to be charging for that after the process? What am I going to need to feel comfortable carrying this child for someone else? So they need to just kind of sit and personally figure that out. The intended parents need to do the same thing. Will we want her breast milk? Will we want her to have a certain type of diet because of, whatever reason? We want to ask her to exercise a certain amount of times a week. There's, sex restrictions as well at different points during the process. So lay out all of that. Then together, once you sort of know what your individual sort of boundaries and sort of what you're expecting are, come together with a meeting of, sort of the four of them, if that's the case, or, the couple or individual and the gestational carrier, and then talk about it. Because there's going to be some things that one side is, this is set in stone. I absolutely need this to walk into this process. And there's going to be some things where you can bend on, I may have thought that I want you to exercise 3 times a week. Maybe I'm not so passionate about that. So then they come into an agreement. And then I think at that point, you generally have your legal representation and talk to them. And then you start drawing up the contract. I say to do it that way because once you kind of get the lawyers involved and you're sort of doing those negotiating after the fact, you're paying for that because they want to receive their compensation hourly. So you sort of figure out that ahead of time, then you present that to your attorneys. So they know you've already talked, you've already had an in-depth conversation about what both parties expect. Then they get together and, the intended parents, their counsel will draw up the gestational carrier agreement. And it's probably like a 30-page document, and it will just iron out every single thing, literally, before the gestational carrier puts the first injection in her stomach. How much is she paid for that? Because every step of the way, she has to be compensated. She's doing something for her body that she would not need to do if not trying to get a child for you. So there's compensation for all of that. Even for her to go to the doctor.
You mentioned something that a lot of people don't think about, right?
Okay.
How would you feel? And I'd like Dr. Wellington's input on this. Okay, the surrogate carries the baby, she delivers. How would you feel if she were the one breastfeeding? Because I had another patient of mine that did do a surrogate and did prime her body and started using breast suction pumps and was actually able to breastfeed her own baby. So I guess it would come to someone like Dr. Wellington, we need to delve into it. What do you feel as a mother, right, if the surrogate breastfeed or you want to breastfeed? I know that, for instance, when I had my children, and call me crazy, but when I had someone can help me carry the baby or hold the baby while the baby's crying, I felt some kind of funny. Like, I want to soothe my own child, right? So how would you feel if it were a surrogate?
And that's very important. In psychology, we have this terminology called bonding. And we know that first 3 days of birth of a child, the bonding with their mother is so significant. And we know the ones that do not bond with their mother the first 3 days, 72 hours, sometimes have a lot of psychological issues. And it's been study after study after study. And I give you an example from orphan children. Unfortunately, a lot of orphan children in a lot of undeveloped countries have a lot of babies and they're put in an orphan immediately with no mother. They was killed from a war or something. Those individuals a lot of times have a lot of psychological issues. And also we have to talk about, and I'm sure Ms. Contrell can speak on this, about the anonymous donor, for whatever reason, doesn't want the receiving family to know who she is, vice versa. So in that way, you can't breastfeed because as soon as the baby is perceived, it's going to the new family. I don't want them to know who I am. So who's going to breastfeed then? So there's so many psychological things involved in this, but at the same token, it would have to be a mature individual, a mature family that's going to say, yes, I want the donor to be able to breastfeed my child. Because, and that's when you're talking about the age, Dr. Famu. If the age sometimes I think what is 19 to 20 and goes up to
20 to
30 to
40,
32.
yeah. Yeah.
Right. So you want a mature individual that can be able to handle that. A lot of people think they can, but like you're saying, when actuality, when it really comes, there maybe has to be a clause in the contract as well saying if for the first week or so, and I feel that I cannot deal with this, I want to be able to have the option to draw back from that. So I like options, and I believe it's best that people have options so the legality can be little to none when it comes to those issues. But the bottom line is it has to be a mature individual that's willing to do that on both sides.
Yashika, can you comment on the kind of support family-wise a surrogate would need? Like, and I know you get wonderful surrogates, right? In the state of Maryland. Why is it sometimes important to have a surrogate close by versus one far away?
Okay. So first you said about support. Obviously you need a support system in any pregnancy, but there's potentially more complications that can arise through these type of pregnancies. So someone that can assist you, because sometimes you're able to go to the intended parents and they can provide you with support, but a good surrogate realizes that they're also going through whatever. Like at the end of the day, this is generally their biological child. So if there is an issue in the pregnancy, they're going through something as parents, and the support that you need may not necessarily come from them. And you need your own family, your own friends to help you through the process, because you also need help, but they may not be the best person or people to support you in that process.
Right.
And I think your second question was?
You have a lot of, what is the advantage of, say, having a surrogate close by? I'll give you an example, and that could go both ways. I've had patients have surrogates all over the place. The last surrogate I saw, the intended parents were in the Middle East, and she lived in Maryland. And they were able to still craft a relationship because they bonded with the surrogate's husband and her kids. So they became almost like a surrogate family, right? So it worked in that regard. But sometimes the surrogate may not have that close unit, so what is it? What is the advantage of having someone locally close by?
Well, one of the big advantages is there's that lessens the chance significantly that you're going to miss the birth, because no matter how, this is, I say, one of the most planned, obviously the most planned way to get pregnant is this process, but you still don't know when a baby is coming. It happens. And the further away the person is, that increases the chance of you missing the birth. And oftentimes that's really the first time that you're actually able to be super involved. I mean, you can go to doctor's appointments and things like that when the baby's in utero, but most parents don't want to miss the actual birth of their child. So that's one thing. Being able to support your surrogate if there is a need, it's easier when you're locally. If you can go to those doctor's appointments while she's pregnant, that helps if that's something that she wants or that you want or that you both want. And you miss a lot of those opportunities. I think we've spoken in the past too about international situations. You just cut out a lot of that because obviously locally is still within the country, but then you have people who are having babies in other countries. And, in these variable times, things can one week be fine and the next week there's a war, and you don't want to be in those situations when your child is there.
I'm glad you mentioned the war because we actually have had patients who've used surrogates in Ukraine. And when the war started out, it was, oh my gosh, where's the baby going to be delivered? How are we going to get our baby out of this war situation? What if the hospital that they're going to go to was bombed and they don't have the medical capabilities to take care of this child? So we did have that scenario happen. The other scenario that one of my patients experienced with another friend of his was, people need to think about, what if the child is born and there's a pregnancy complication and the child is delivered, say, at 26 weeks gestation? That's a premature infant. If you're in a country like the US, 26, no big deal, right? They have an intensive NICU that can take care of neonatal intensive care unit that can take care of the pregnancy. So you need to make arrangements. What arrangements are you going to make if your child is born and there is no NICU where that surrogate is, right? So those are things that they need to hash out in whatever contract they're going to sign. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. Even things as simple as, or well, not as simple, but when the pandemic happened, there were countries, I know of couples that they had to fly to the country to obviously, be there for labor and delivery, pick up their baby, and they caught COVID. And each country had their own laws and regulations about that. And for them, they actually had to miss the birth of their child because they had to be quarantined for X amount of time. And it was probably about 3 weeks before they actually got to see their baby, and then another month before they could leave the country. So there's so many variables. And legally, this is already such a gray and confusing area that you just want to trim down a lot of that fat and just make it as simple as you possibly can.
Okay, so now what I'm going to ask you now, Ishika, is, okay, I want you to take me through, and we'll get to Dr. Roderick where he can input as well. Someone is starting today. I'm looking for a surrogate. I give them your name. Walk us through step by steps. What are the things that need to happen? What should they look for before we get to where we're even transferring an embryo?
Well, the first thing they have to decide is, are they going to look for their surrogate on their own, or are they going to work with an agency? Right. If you work with an agency, then obviously they're going to find a person for you, and you're going to give them specifically what you need, because different individuals have different things that they require for their surrogate, depending on things like their faith, their culture. They may have different things that are specific to them. So figure all of that out, and then once you kind of get to that point, you sort of come across candidates that could carry for you. And when you're at that stage, think about, can I interact with this person? Would we have a good working relationship for a year? Because it's generally that, and that's a quick process if you're only working together for a year, because every transfer doesn't take the first time and every process doesn't go smoothly. Even just getting the contracts done can take 2 or 3 months on both sides, plus a pregnancy, plus all of these things. So this person is somebody who's going to be a pretty big part of your life for a year. So can you work with them? What type of temperament does that person have? Is it something that you can work with? You mentioned multiple times tonight, maturity. Maturity is huge. It makes a huge, huge difference. Are they able to maturely handle some of the emotions that may come up for you as an intended parent in the process? So you have to think about all of those things when you're looking. And then once you finally identified a person and you've gone through that conversation we talked about earlier with, kind of figuring out what each side needs and then getting with your lawyers and things, then they have to go through medical clearance. And that's when they're back with, Dr. Yemi, and she's saying, can I successfully put an embryo in you that I believe will turn into a viable pregnancy?
So they get medical clearance after the surrogate gets medical clearance. They go through your agency, you find a surrogate. Now they're cleared, and I said, okay, good to go. What next?
Then actually I spoke about legal, but legal then happens at that point after they're medically cleared.
So legal after medical clearance. What is legal?
Legal is drawing up that gestational carrier agreement. I would still say do those individual conversations without the lawyer before.
Okay.
Now at this point, you're drawing in lawyers. And because they've been medically cleared, now you're really ready to go. So you sit with the lawyers, you get the contracts drawn up, and then
now you mentioned, I'm going to take you back, that we need 2 sets of lawyers, right? Let's talk about that. Why do you need 2 sets of lawyers?
Because if you were to only have one lawyer, it's a conflict of interest. Who are they representing?
Correct.
And a lot would argue that in that situation, they would be representing the intended parents because that's the person who's paying them. When you go through the process, everything financially is going to be coming out of the intended parent's pocket. But the lawyer for the gestational carrier should only be representing the gestational carrier. That's whose interests they have at heart. They need to be lobbying to make sure that her rights are preserved.
So we need 2 sets of lawyers, one for the intended parent, one for the gestational surrogate, correct?
Correct.
Now we've done legal. When do we get to Dr. Wellington?
I'm sorry, I missed. He actually also comes before legal.
He comes before legal.
Yes. So similar to the lawyer, there is a therapist for the gestational carrier. There is a separate one for the intended parent. So they should not have the same person. Then there's a group session that's done after that. So Dr. Wellington would clear whichever party he represents. The other doctor would clear whichever party they represent. And then you pick whichever one you'd like. And then one of them does a group session.
So in the group session, Dr. Wellington at that point would be meeting with the intended parents and the gestational surrogate at that point. Does both psychologists need to be in that meeting or just one?
Just one.
But
it has to be this one who's done one of the individual meetings.
Correct.
As well.
Okay.
And spouses so the gestational carrier's husband, boyfriend, significant other, to be involved as well.
All right. So we do medical clearance. We get psychological evaluation for both parties, then a group session together, at which point they now go to legal, and legal has to be one legal team for the intended parent and one legal team for the gestational surrogate, correct?
Correct.
And then what happens? What's the next step?
After that, we are ready to come back to
We're ready
you.
to roll.
We need to transfer.
All right. Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes. Do you want to add anything, Dr. Wellington?
No, it sounds great. And again, like you say, the comprehensive assessment is very important to make sure that everything is up and on board and target and ready to go.
So I would say the key takeaway that I'm hearing from both of you at this point, it is essential the consent of the gestational surrogate has to be aware throughout. She has to be made aware of her rights. And I think at any point in time, the gestational surrogate has the right to back out, correct? She can say, I don't want to do this anymore. And at no point in time should they feel like they were coerced.
That's correct.
Absolutely, that's a big deal because that's actually part of the court process. If there's any inkling of coercion, that does not look good for your parentage.
Yes, and sometimes when people seek overseas surrogate, you might want to make sure that the surrogate being used was not coerced, right? Because they may have been. You don't know, right?
Absolutely.
You know, if it's in a third world country, you're not there. Then another thing I want to touch on, heaven forbid, what happens if you run under the bus before the baby's born, the surrogate delivers, the other partner has a heart attack and kaputs?
Wow.
What's the surrogate to do?
That's in the contract. Wills have to be updated. Your wills have to be updated to include the embryos and to include the surrogate. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, she also needs to be paid. It does not matter that you're dead. She needs to be compensated. She has carried a child for you. This child also is not her child. She needs to go somewhere. So is there a grandparent, your sister, your best friend but the child needs to be left to someone no different than if already here and 6 months old and something happened to you. So all of this stuff has to be ironed out. That's why there's a lot of legal aspects to this process, a lot of documents that need to be done.
Thank you so much, Yashika. Yes, the reason I mentioned that, we had a gestational surrogate case where the parents were in a different country. The surrogate was here in Maryland, and the baby was born during COVID, right before everybody started locking down, and the lawyer died. The lawyer for the intended parents died. So we had to track down, I guess he didn't make clear arrangements. We had to track down another lawyer who had taken over his caseload so that things could be properly done. The proper birth certificate could be obtained. Talking of birth certificates, tell me, how do we get a birth certificate for the baby, right? Surrogate goes in, delivers from the baby. She delivered, not the intended parent. What's the birth certificate going to look like in the state of Maryland, outside the state of Maryland?
Okay. In the state of Maryland, Maryland is considered a more surrogate-friendly state. So there are states that are surrogate-friendly. There are states that are more surrogate-friendly. There are states that are less surrogate-friendly. And there are states where it's illegal. So Maryland, we're more surrogate-friendly. That means that the courts here honor a pre-birth order. So around the 4th to 5th month of pregnancy, your lawyer would draw up a pre-birth order and would take that to file it with the court. And at that point, the judge will basically issuing a court order on what's to happen at the hospital. Who are the parents? So it would put the intended parents are Jane and John Doe. And so now the hospital knows at birth, Jane and John Doe are the parents. This is important because that's whose name is now going to go on the birth certificate. That's who's going to make medical decisions for that child, because you just saw the child come out of this woman, yet she no longer has rights once that baby is any medical decisions on that baby. That's not her child. And the pre-birth order sort of certifies that. Whose insurance does the child go on? What if there's like a little minor surgery that's $10,000 that needs to be had an hour after birth? Whose insurance pays for that? So all of these things are covered. And it also it works to sort of eliminate hurt feelings at birth, because at the end of the day, a lot of times the hospital staff is going to focus on, care more about the surrogate. But you also don't really want to be in a situation where the baby comes out and they hand the baby to the surrogate. That's generally not what most intended parents want. They want to be the first ones to hold their baby.
So-
Skin to skin, that important,
Yeah. So what you're saying is we really need to know where the surrogate lives. It matters.
Yes.
You pick a surrogate, say in Michigan, what can you expect?
To go to court and battle for your baby for months on end. It's not legal in Michigan. And while there have been some counties in Michigan that have sort of turned a blind eye for it, there have been very many cases recently where parents have fought for years. And I mean, they did a very legal surrogacy process. They didn't, do anything sort of, well, not legal, but they did it proper. So it wasn't like anything under the, it went through a fertility clinic and everything. But because she gave birth in Michigan, it's not legal there. And yeah, you're going to have to fight for
the surrogate could say, you know what? I'm thinking about this. I think I want this child for my own, right? When I live in Michigan, so I'm not giving the child up. I don't care if the eggs or sperm didn't come from me or my partner. I want this child. Can they do that?
That could happen. And in the situation I'm thinking of, the court could say the surrogate doesn't want the baby, but the court said, the hospital said the baby came out of this woman. So she is going on the birth certificate. Oh, and her husband is going on as the father because she's married. And then you have to fight that. It's very expensive and stressful.
So the take home is intended parent beware. Don't do your own kind of thing. Get somebody who's had years of doing surrogacy. Get someone who knows the laws. Get someone like Miss Cantrell who knows the ins and outs in each state. Get a psychologist like Dr. Wellington who's been talking to people for years so that we don't have these conflicts, correct?
That's awesome.
Thank you so much. I really, I thank you so much for spending the time with us. Thank you everyone for being with us. I hope we've answered some of the questions. Send us any questions that you may have that you still have underlying questions you're not quite clear about. We will be more than happy to shed some light. I would be happy to send questions to Ms. Cantrell and to Dr. Wellington. We'll be happy to share information with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, so I'm going to